Bon Scott rocked harder, lived louder, and broke every rule in the book. Pure rebellion, pure rock. Bon Scott was the real deal.
Sort of knew how to blow and finger, so I just...
With Bon, it was always full throttle, no brakes. Bon Scott was the ultimate rebel, loud, proud, and untamed.
With bullet in his back!
Like, subscribe. Thank you.
Ronald Belford Bon Scott was born on July 9th, 1946 in Forfar, Scotland. His parents were Charles and Isabel Scott. Bon's family lived in Carrymere, where his dad was a baker and his mom was a housewife. The Scotts were blue-collar folk, and Bon's early life was tough, reflecting the struggles of post-war Britain. Young Bon Scott was a real handful as a kid, always getting into mischief, a habit that stuck with him throughout his entire life. The Scott family had packed up and moved to Australia in 1952, hoping for a better life, and they landed in Fremantle, a coastal town in Western Australia. Bon, still young, moved to Australia and embraced the laid-back lifestyle, quickly adapting to the sun, surf, and the freedom that it offered. However, it wasn't all smooth sailing. School was definitely not Scott's cup of tea, and he found it hard to fit in with the system's strict rules. He ended up dropping out at the age of 15 to focus on music instead. And Scott's parents, both musically inclined, introduced him to music early on. His mom played piano, and his dad was a singer who would often perform at local gigs. And growing up in the middle of Australia's lively rock and roll scene in the late 50s and early 60s, Scott ended up developing a strong musical foundation as well as ambition. He ended up drumming in local bands, and in short order, he became known as a talented and energetic performer. Bon Scott started getting serious with music in the mid-60s, forming a band called the Spectres in Perth, Australia. Bon started out drumming and sometimes singing in the group, who mostly played local gigs and built up a small fan base. Scott's music was shaped by the blues and rock and roll legends like Little Richard, which gave him his own unique voice. However, the Spectres didn't last long, but they gave Scott his first real experience playing for a crowd.
Right now, John Collins is going to take up the drums, and then the drummer, Bon Scott, is going to be singing a song, and it's a number called Gloria.
I'm gonna shout all night long. I'm gonna shout every day.
The Spectres joined forces with the Winstons in 1966 to become the Valentines. This new band, featuring Scott and Vince Lovegrove sharing lead vocals, became quickly a hit in Melbourne's music scene. The Valentines were famous for their bubblegum pop sound, definitely a stark contrast to the hard rock style that Bon would become known later for. Their biggest hits, like My Old Man's a Groovy Old Man and Juliet, showed off Bon Scott's singing chops, but also hinted at the band's growing internal struggles as they tried to figure out their sound. In 1969, the Valentines got caught up in a big drug scandal, where some members were arrested for having pot, and the incident was a big deal for the band, leading to their split in 1970. Scott's rebellious streak was evident during this time as he openly challenged conventional thinking. And even though his band broke up, Scott was already becoming well-known and an impressive lead singer, setting the stage for future achievements. Following the split with the Valentines, Bon Scott joined the Adelaide band Fraternity in 1970. Their album Fraternity marked a major shift for the Valentines, moving away from the pop roots and exploring a blend of progressive rock, blues, and folk. The band had a bunch of experienced musicians, and Scott joined as the lead singer, letting him hone his onstage skills and singing style. Fraternity had a couple hits, including Season of Change, which featured Bon's amazing lead vocals and haunting recorder. And the band, with their wives and girlfriends, kids and crew and tour manager in tow, decided to make that trip to London. Bon, who had recently become close to a local girl named Irene Thornton, persuaded her to marry him. They ended up tying the knot on January 24th, 1972 in Adelaide, and so they planned their honeymoon in London with the Fraternity. Irene recalled meeting him for the first time, seeing the shirtless guy wearing shorts that would make Lieutenant Dangle blush, no shoes, his arm around a girl and a drink in the other hand, laughing loudly as he navigated through the crowd, total Bon Scott style. They ended up bumping into each other again at a fraternity show, and Irene's perspective changed at that point. A few jokes later, she actually started liking him. But the thing is, living in North London, Bon Scott was broke, so he ended up taking a part-time job as a bartender at a local pub. Ironically, even though high-quality marijuana was readily available in Adelaide Hills, it was difficult to find. It wasn't like they were picky. Bon got the name Road Test Ronnie, because he was basically the guinea pig that would be the first to try any new drugs that came along. And Bon was remembered as somebody who could handle any drug that was thrown at him, whether man-made or naturally occurring. But then he had a bad trip when he tried Datura, which is a powerful hallucinogen, and so everybody knew to back away from that stuff. But it wasn't long before things would take a turn for the worse in the group. They missed their chance to open for Status Quo, and then got overshadowed by Slade's flamboyant look, and even a makeover with a new name and the image Fang did not help. They finally just had to eat their words after opening for a group called Gordy, who was doing pretty well, but Bon happened to be completely captivated by the band's singer, Brian Johnson.
Patch up your world, which was broken into.
And what really took Bon back was how he ended the show, where Brian was lying on his back, screaming in pain. Bon had no idea that Brian Johnson actually had a burst appendix and the agony was real. And Brian Johnson remembers his single meeting with Bon vividly, noting his short hair and missing tooth, but he found Bon to be hilarious and they had a great time. He had admitted, though, that Bon wasn't as good as he was when he joined AC/DC, and that the band ended up bringing out a different side in him. After that, Fang, formerly Fraternity, packed it in and headed back to Australia. Before things got a little better, there was definitely a dark period. Back in his hometown, Bon joined a music group called the Mountie Loft Rangers, led by Peter Head. By this time, Bon was 28 years old and hadn't achieved the success that he was hoping he would get. He was feeling stuck, frustrated, a bit too old for all of this. One night, he ended up getting in a fight with his wife, Irene, and on February 22nd, 1974, everything just came crashing down. He had shown up to a Rangers practice already smashed out of his mind. Peter Head said that he had always carried a flask of red wine or a bottle of Jack, and it turned out to be a pretty intense experience. That night, the members of the group had a funny feeling that Bon wasn't really frustrated so much with what was going on, but that maybe it was a bit more personal. They got into a huge heated argument. The band members told them that they would beat the crap out of him, and so he ended up slamming through the door, jumping on his bike, tossing his empty bottle of Jack onto the ground where it smashed to pieces, and then at 2 in the morning, his old bandmate Vince got a call. Bon had crashed his bike into a car that was coming toward him, and he ended up in a coma. But Bon was known for his love of motorcycles, which reflected his wild and reckless personality, but that night, he was pretty damn drunk and couldn't think straight. He had actually crashed into this car head-on, and the crash was so brutal, flinging Bon Scott off of his bike and leaving him with a bunch of injuries. He ended up getting rushed to Queen Elizabeth Hospital, where he was deemed in serious condition. His injuries were actually so bad that the doctors had told his wife, Irene, to brace herself for the worst. His condition was so bad that the doctors were even talking about getting a priest in there to give him his last rites. Still, though, after a few days, Scott ended up waking up, even though things were looking pretty rough. He had broken some bones, and he needed a lot of time to heal. He couldn't even walk on his own for a while and had to use crutches to get around. Unfortunately, though, the accident, along with Bon Scott's lifestyle at that time, was causing too many relationship problems, and so he and Irene ended up splitting up. But while in recovery, Bon wanted to stay in touch with the music scene, even though he couldn't perform. His buddy Vince, who had been in the Valentines with him, suggested that he become a roadie for some Aussie bands. So Scott ended up being a roadie, responsible for setting up gear, handling logistics, making sure the bands he worked with could perform without any technical problems. The gig definitely wasn't glamorous, but it kept Scott in the music scene and kept him connected with musicians and industry folks. And it was this very position that would actually end up connecting him to the band that would turn him into a megastar. While working as a roadie, Scott met the members of AC/DC, Malcolm and Angus Young, who had put the band together back in '73. And they were still figuring things out. They hadn't quite nailed their sound yet. Scott was initially brought on to handle equipment and logistics, but he ended up winning over the brothers. AC/DC's first singer, Dave Evans, wasn't exactly clicking with the band's musical direction.
Can I sit next to you, girl? Can I sit next to you, girl?
And everybody felt that a change was in order. And the story goes that Scott really became the lead singer by pure luck after working as a roadie.
And I used to drive the band around from hotel to the gig, back to the hotel, you know. And these guys were looking for a singer. And I said, I can sing. So they gave me a tryout, and I got the job.
AC/DC dropped their first record, High Voltage, in 1975, kicking off a new chapter in rock and roll. The album was a rough around the edges collection of songs, highlighting the band's raw, bluesy rock and roll origin. They tracked the album at Albert Studios in Sydney. Harry Vonda and George Young, Malcolm and Angus's older brother, handled the production. They knocked out most of the tracks in just a few recording sessions, making it a pretty quick process. And right out of the gate, Bon Scott proved himself to be a really strong singer, melding perfectly with the Young brothers' guitar skills. Their cover of Baby Please Don't Go, as well as the song She's Got Balls, showed that they were all about the raw, raunchy rock and roll, keeping it simple, direct, and energetic. The album ended up getting a mixed reception when it dropped. Some critics just thought it was a ripoff of other stuff, but others dug its raw energy and potential. So while it didn't get stellar critical reception, it was definitely loved by AC/DC's fans and planted the seeds for the sound that AC/DC would become known for. This album also featured a track that Angus Young considered his biggest regret, love song Oh Gene. It's definitely a surprising departure for AC/DC, where it deviates away from the hard rock formula with much softer melodies, slightly reminiscent of Dream On from Aerosmith, but with much more of a classic 60s feel, considering when it was recorded. But this album landed the band on the map. Even though Bon Scott had been with AC/DC for just a few months, his impact was immediate and profound. His vocal style blended that raw, bluesy tone with a punk-like sneer, and it became a defining feature of their sound overall. And the thing about Bon Scott is that his lyrics were often drawn from his own life experience, with a lot of grit and humor, and just unapologetically honest. And Bon Scott's influence extended beyond just his vocal performance. His presence in the studio actually brought a new level of confidence and swagger to the group. Right after this album, the band embarked on an extensive tour across Australia, playing countless gigs and clubs and pubs and small venues. But in short order, the band would get to work on their second album, TNT, which was released in December of 1975. And this was really where their sound came together. They ducked back into Albert Studios in Sydney, Australia during the fall of 75, where Vonda and Young got right back to work in the production seat. But this time, the band was a lot more focused. And listening to the album, you could definitely hear that they had developed more confidence in their sound. They had Phil Rudd as the drummer and Mark Evans on the bass, and that rhythm section was able to lay down something solid and simple, perfect for the AC/DC sound. Now that the band had played out for a while, they're really interested in capturing that live sound on record. So it was pretty much about minimal overdubs, live takes, allowing the natural chemistry to shine through. Angus was wielding his trusty Gibson SG Standard paired with a Marshall Plexi 1959 amp. This gave him that razor-sharp, high-energy guitar sound. Very raw and aggressive, not a whole ton of gain. And Malcolm's rhythm guitar work, which is also a crucial element of AC/DC's sound, was anchored by his Gretsch Jet Firebird, which he played through a Marshall 100-watt super lead amp. What's interesting about the production of these early albums is that they were not drenched in reverb. Everything was punchy and present. Bon Scott sang through a Neumann U47 microphone, chosen for its ability to capture that rawness and intensity of his voice, kicking it off with It's a Long Way to the Top If You Want to Rock and Roll, one of AC/DC's most iconic songs to date. It's an anthem for anybody who's ever struggled to make it in the music business. For this one, Bon Scott even busted out the bagpipes to do a solo, and this goes right into Rock and Roll Singer, where the lyrics reflect Bon Scott's journey from a small-town kid to a rock star at this point. Another standout track is The Jack, which is just a down-home, raunchy, bluesy track telling a funny story about VD, masked as a card game metaphor. She's got the jack. And in this song, you could really hear Bon Scott's wordplay and storytelling, and that snarky sense of humor that he had really shine through on this one. And of course, TNT, the title track, is an all-out anthem, and it quickly became one of AC/DC's most signature tracks.
Planets like a town. Don't you mistake now.
The power chords were so simple, E, G, A, G, A, G, and Bon Scott's lyrical bravado over the top of this makes this one of the most catchiest songs in their catalog. But this album in particular was a huge turning point for the band. It really marked the beginning of their rise to international fame. After this album, the band decided to tour Australia, but then also start exploring some other territory. So they set up a UK tour in 1976. And even though at that time they were relatively unknown in Europe, they actually went over really well. And during the breaks between these tours, AC/DC would return to the studio to work on new material, which would eventually become Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap. They went into the same studio, same gear, same producers, same resolution to just keep things simple and clean throughout the recording process. But while AC/DC pretty much blew up on the Australian music scene, they still wanted to make more inroads into Europe, and they were still considered a bit raw and rough around the edges in the European and American markets. Starting out with the title track, Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, Bon Scott's humor was on full display, with lyrics telling the story of a man offering to solve problems for a price. And this one became an instant classic, between its infectious riff, blazing guitar solo, and Bon Scott's menacing and playful vocal delivery. Another standout track on this one was actually the relative ballad, Ride On, which was written about Bon Scott's experiences on the road and loneliness that came with life in a rock band. Lyrics talks about regrets and missed opportunities, but it was delivered so soulfully, with just a nice mellow rock backbeat and a laid-back swing to the groove. And of course, there's the song Big Balls, which really was a great showcase for Bon Scott's talent for wordplay. It's basically a satire on high society with double entendres of its language, delivered in this kind of mock, formal style, making it one of the most hilarious tracks in the band's catalog. With a lyric like, "My balls are always bouncing from the left and to the right. It's my belief that my big balls should be held every night. You just can't beat it." But this was the album that really introduced AC/DC to more mainstream audience. They had a bit more polish, but not too much. They were still rough and raw, but as a group, they really fully gelled by this time. By the time AC/DC got to recording their next album, Let There Be Rock, they were starting to feel the pressures of this international success they were achieving. The band had really kept a grueling schedule, just touring and recording and touring and recording, but they didn't slow down. Instead, they just channeled their frustrations and energy into the music. Bon Scott, who by this time was really the charismatic face of the band, was really at his peak during the recording of this album. The album opens with Go Down, which is a hard driving track that sets the tone for what's to come, with the lyrics, of course, talking about going down. And the title track, Let There Be Rock, is a total anthem, paying tribute to the origins of rock and roll. This song builds slowly, with Angus Young's guitar just gradually increasing in intensity before exploding into one of his most blistering solos so far. Bon Scott's lyrics tell the story of the birth of rock, and they're delivered with a sense of reverence and power that makes this track one of the band's defining moments.
The guitar man got famous. The businessman got rich. Wow!
But as the band had different releases, international releases and so forth, the song Problem Child, which actually appeared on the international release of this album, was originally included in Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap. And it is hard-driving AC/DC at its best during those times. And the lyrics are just pure rebellion. Basically a very violent, don't mess with me kind of vibe coming from it. And this album closes with Whole Lotta Rosie, which was one of their most famous tracks, telling the story of a large woman who made a very big impression on Bon Scott. Kind of like the AC/DC version of Brick House. And the riff is one of the most iconic in rock history, with Angus Young delivering a searing performance. This song ended up becoming a really huge staple in their live shows. AC/DC's next album, Power Rage, stands as really a big chapter in AC/DC's discography. It stood as the bridge really between their kind of more raw, hard-hitting sound of their earlier work, but the more polished, commercially successful records that would follow. The band had parted with Evans and they brought in bassist Cliff Williams, making a change to the lineup. And this was also the last one that was actually produced by Harry Vonda and George Young. And for this one, they had actually split up recording between Albert Studios in Sydney, Australia, and also in the UK at the famed Island Studios. And the recording sessions for this album were pretty intense because the band felt pressure to really have to kind of follow up to the success of their previous album, Let There Be Rock. Bon's lyrics on Power Age were some of his most poignant, reflecting the hardships that he was facing as a musician constantly on the move. And his vocal performances were real standouts, showing his ability to convey a really wide range of emotions, from anger to frustration to vulnerability and regret. Starting off with Rock and Roll Damnation, with its catchy riff written by Malcolm Young, and Bon Scott's rebellious lyrics really set the tone for what the album is to come. And with this one, the backing vocals are more lush. They even added in some hand claps, so it had a slightly more polished feel already. Another standout track is Sin City, where the lyrics reflect Bond's fascination with the darker side of fame and fortune. This one also features some seriously infectious riffs throughout.
Introduce a bunch of boys from,
Yeah, some Australian boys, some rockers. They rock and roll in Australia. This is the rumors.
did a whole last tour with us entitled AC/DC. Give me some!
Yeah, that's good. That's my belief. Fingers
And the closer, Kicked in the Teeth, is the heaviest on the album. Lyrically, it reflects Bon Scott's anger and frustration with betrayal. It's one hell of a closer, with the band driving one hell of a fast-paced groove, and Bon just screaming at the top of his range over the top. It is the essence of pure rock and roll. Their next album, Highway to Hell, was a huge turning point for the band. It would be the last album that Bon Scott would sing on, and they had brought in producer John Mutt Lang to take the helm, where he pushed them into all sorts of different musical directions. Unlike Vonda and Young, John was very meticulous and had a lot of attention to detail. This was also recorded in different studios, Roundhouse Studios in London, and later also at Criteria Studios in Miami. And John Mutt Lang's influence on the band was immediate. He was pushing them to achieve a higher level of precision and polish than they had on any of their previous albums. He insisted on multiple takes until they got it right, even having Angus Young sit in the room with him to put down his solo for Highway to Hell, literally talking him through some of the parts to make sure that they were played exactly the way he was expecting it to be. The gear that they used in the studio hadn't changed much, and as a result, the band really never lost the essence of their sound with this. But yet this album, Highway to Hell, definitely showed a more focused and disciplined AC/DC than prior. And for Bon Scott in particular, the Highway to Hell sessions were intense. While he embraced John's push for perfection, the grueling process really was taking a toll on him. Also, Bon Scott's lifestyle, which was marked by heavy drinking and hard living, was really beginning to catch up with him during this time. The opening track, Highway to Hell, is one of the most iconic songs in rock in general. Bon Scott's lyrics speak to the hardships of life on the road, but they still have that sense of determination and grit. But lyrically, it's also about the Canning Highway in Australia. And this highway runs through Fremantle, where Bon Scott had actually lived, ending at a place called the Raffles, which is a bar. But as the highway comes to an end, it became a steep decline. And as a result, a lot of accidents happened when they were going really fast over that intersection after a night out. So the lyrics is sort of hopeful that he'd be taking the ride down that road, hoping not to end up like so many others who never reached that destination. But this song ended up becoming the actual first song of AC/DC's to chart in the US, and as a result, massive sales for the album. Another standout track, Beatin' Around the Bush, has one of Angus's and Malcolm's most aggressive and complex riffs to date. It almost has a chicken pickin' vibe, and it works really well with the fast-paced rock grooves that the band were playing. And the song Touch Too Much kind of hit a different aspect of AC/DC's sound, having much more of a polished and melodic sound. And on this one, you could really hear John Mutt Lang's production, where the guitars were layered as well as the vocals. Bon's lyrics describe a love affair that's both thrilling as well as overwhelming, and it really proved to be a good show of Bon's vocal chops during that time. And this album really turned out to be the watershed moment for AC/DC. It propelled them to global stardom. After the album was released, the band hit the road, and it was a hectic touring schedule. They played to sold-out crowds across the US and Europe, and the band was really on fire, delivering electrifying performances night after night. However, the demands of constant touring was starting to take their toll on the group, particularly Bon Scott. Life on the road by this point was just grueling. Long hours, little rest, and the pressures of keeping high standards of performance. And Bon Scott was always living that hard drinking, hard living lifestyle, and the pressures of fame and the physical demands of touring really made it worse. Bon Scott's behavior became increasingly erratic during this time. While he was still capable of delivering powerful performances on stage, those close to him noticed that his offstage behavior was becoming more unpredictable. He'd disappear for hours or even days, indulging in drinking binges that left him physically and emotionally drained. Bandmates and friends of his were getting concerned, but Scott's persona as a rock and roll wild man made it difficult for them to really intervene. Also, too, the band dynamic was starting to change. Malcolm and Angus were increasingly taking the lead in creative and business decisions, which sometimes left Bon Scott feeling kind of sidelined. As 1979 was coming to a close, AC/DC was riding high on the success of this latest album, Highway to Hell. But Bon Scott's health and well-being were starting to deteriorate. The band had plans to start work on their next album, and while Scott was excited about the future, there were growing concerns about his ability to continue at the same pace. In early 1980, just after the release of Highway to Hell, Bon Scott traveled to London to spend time with some friends. Prior to that, he had enjoyed some downtime in Sydney, hanging out with his family. But at that time, Bon's parents really noticed that his drinking had escalated quite a lot. But then again, it was New Year, 1980, so they figured it was just par for the course. So when he flew back to London in January of 1980, Bon felt less rested and more just basically spaced out. So he arranged to get his own place in London. His girlfriend gave him some basic furniture and kitchen utensils and stuff to help him move in. He started calling up old friends that he hadn't talked to in years, but nobody had really gotten any sense that anything was wrong with him. And he was really excited about the new stuff that the band was working on at that time. This was most likely material that would end up being Back in Black. On February 18th, 1980, Bon Scott went out in London with some friends, including musician Alistair Kinnear, and they hit up a bunch of pubs and clubs that night, ending up at the Music Machine in Camden, where they spent hours knocking back some drinks. By the end of the night, Bon Scott was pretty out of it. Kinnear ended up helping Bon out into his own car, a Renault 5, and let him sleep it off in his back seat. Kinnear later said that he had checked in on Scott a few times during the night, finding him still out cold, but thinking he'd be around once the booze wore off. However, the next morning, when Kinnear went to wake Bon Scott, he immediately knew something was wrong. Scott was completely unconscious and had apparently thrown up sometime during the night. Kinnear, freaking out, drove him straight to King's College Hospital, but by that time, Bon Scott was already gone. The official report said that he had died from alcohol poisoning, but conflicting stories say that he froze to death overnight because it was very cold out. Kinnear had said that he put a blanket over him at some point in the night, but Kinnear himself hasn't been found to be able to get more of the story. People presume he's long gone as well. Nevertheless, this was a huge blow to his bandmates in AC/DC, who were totally thrown for a loop, and they really didn't even think they'd be able to keep going. I mean, Bon Scott wasn't just their singer. He was really the heart and soul of the band, influenced the sound and overall image. The band were very close to calling it quits, but with Bon's family support, as well as John Mutt Lange's push, the band decided to stick it out. Finding a new singer would prove really difficult, especially since Bon Scott was just such a huge personality. The band wanted somebody who could bring their own style to the table. They knew of Brian Johnson, who had sang with Gordy, and actually, when Bon Scott was alive, he had also sang his praises. So they invited Johnson to try out with AC/DC in London, and Brian actually didn't even think that he was being considered for the position of replacing Bon at the time, but the chemistry was instant. The moment he started singing Whole Lotta Rosie and Nutbush City Limits, the chemistry was instant. The band would take to the studio and record what would be their biggest album ever, Back in Black, in April of 1980. Just a few months after Bon Scott had died. They dedicated the album to him, and it is really something that the band was able to find success after losing such an iconic vocalist. Brian brought a lot to the table, but Bon Scott will always be remembered as one of the most raw, real, and charismatic personalities in rock and roll, period. While the rest of the band was a bit on the introverted side, Bon Scott made friends with anybody and everybody he came into contact with. People said that he was the type of guy that would just give you the shirt off his back. And though there's a lot of debate about exactly how Bon Scott passed away, one thing's for sure: his influence on music is undeniable. His journey was a roller coaster, filled with massive successes as well as tough times, and his legend keeps growing, with Bon Scott's life and music still captivating new generations of fans. And there is no doubt just how much Bon Scott's massive impact on music and culture helped pave the way for AC/DC's continued success. Something really weird I just found out: the most expensive guitar on Amazon is a signature guitar, and you won't believe whose signature guitar it is. I left the link below in the description. And to my subscribers, I really want to thank you so much for all the inspiration and feedback. I truly do appreciate it. And if you haven't had a chance to subscribe to this channel, make sure you smack that subscribe button. While you're at it, hit the like button, join the family, and want to thank you so much for watching.